He had always been the quiet one in the room, the kind of person people noticed only when they needed a chair moved or an instrument carried. Every morning, before the sun even touched the windows of the community music center, he arrived with the same calm expression. He would unlock the side door, switch on the dim hallway lights, and begin arranging the rehearsal rooms long before anyone else showed up. He didn't complain. He didn't rush. He just worked with a steady focus, as if he had lived his whole life in the rhythm of silence. Most of the students who came to practice barely knew anything about him. They only knew he worked there, which for them automatically meant he wasn't a musician. Some whispered that he lacked confidence. Others guessed he tried music once but wasn't good enough. No one bothered to ask him the truth. They simply assumed. And assumptions often grow louder when the person they're about is quiet. Behind his back, people talked softly, but their words reached his ears anyway. He never reacted, though sometimes the words stung longer than he liked to admit. Every afternoon, he would sit at the far corner of the hall during auditions, pretending to check cables or dust a music stand, while secretly listening to every performance. He didn't complain even when people stepped around him as if he were invisible. He had gotten used to that feeling years ago, the feeling of being there but not really seen. One day the center buzzed with excitement. A famous director was visiting to select musicians for a big showcase. Students hurried in and out of rooms, practicing scales, warming up their hands, brushing their hair, adjusting their jackets. Conversations filled the hallways, all carrying the same hope to impress the director. Enough to earn a chance on that stage. He watched it all quietly as he fixed a loose pedal on an old piano. He had done this many times, tuning keys, tightening screws, softening hammers, but today his hands felt heavier. He knew why. Moments like this reminded him of a dream he never dared to chase openly. A dream he carried quietly in the corners of his heart, where no one could mock it. Music was the only thing that made him feel alive, but he had never been part of these auditions. Not even once. When the director arrived, the whole building seemed to straighten its posture. He walked through the halls with a commanding presence, greeting the staff and shaking hands with a few promising students. When he passed by the quiet young man, he gave a polite nod. The same nod someone might give a janitor or a backstage. Helper polite but distant. The young man didn't expect anything more. He rarely expected anything at all. The auditions began shortly after. Students played complicated pieces, each hoping to catch the director's attention. Some did well, some made mistakes, some tried too hard. The director listened with a calm, unreadable face. He took notes. He whispered comments to his assistant. He rarely smiled. The quiet young man stayed on the sidelines, as always. He handed out sheet music. He adjusted the microphone. He picked up fallen pencils. He kept the room organized so the auditions ran smoothly. And every time a student played the piano, he listened closely. The way someone listens to a language they know by heart but never get to speak aloud. People whispered again, just like they always did. They didn't whisper to be cruel. It was more out of habit, the kind of whispering people do when they think they understand someone's life based on very little. He's always around the piano, but he never plays. I think he tried music once but gave up. No, I heard he didn't get into any music school. That's why he works here. I guess he doesn't mind doing the small jobs. He heard those words while picking up sheet music from a chair. For a moment he paused, but he didn't turn around and he didn't correct them. He just carried on with his work. Inside him, though the truth felt heavy, he hadn't given up on music. Not at all. He played every night in an empty room after his shift ended, when no one was around to judge or compare him with others. He taught himself pieces that most people assumed required years of training. He practiced until the world outside faded away, but he kept it to himself. He didn't feel he belonged among the students, and he didn't want anyone to laugh at him if they discovered his secret. So he stayed quiet. It was easier. Later in the day, the director took a break. He walked around the hall, exploring the rooms casually. When he passed by the main rehearsal room, he found the young man fixing the piano bench again. "You take care of the instruments?" the director asked. He looked up, not expecting the question. "Yes, I try." The director nodded and walked away. It was a short exchange, but for a second, the young man wondered if maybe the director had seen him as more than just a helper. But the thought faded quickly. People like him weren't noticed, not in this world. As the day continued, something unusual happened. The pianist, scheduled for the evening rehearsal, hadn't arrived. People thought he was running late, but then a call came saying he was sick and wouldn't be able to come at all. The news traveled fast, creating sudden tension in the room. Students exchanged worried looks. Staff members began whispering about postponing the rehearsal. The director didn't look pleased. He needed to finalize some decisions today, and without a pianist, the whole schedule was falling apart. "Is there no one else available?" the director asked, scanning the room. A few students shook their heads. Some looked down. No one volunteered. The older staff member, who had worked at the center for years, looked around the room and then at the young man standing near the piano. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. He might be able to play. The older man said softly. Everyone turned to look at him. The young man froze. His face warmed, not from embarrassment, but from fear that someone might laugh. And they did. A few students snickered quietly, trying to hide it but not doing a very good job. "He? Play?" Someone whispered. "He only cleans the room." Another muttered. The director looked at him with raised eyebrows, clearly unconvinced. "Do you play?" the director asked. He swallowed. His heart beat fast. He wanted to say no, to avoid attention, to avoid judgment. But the older staff member who believed in him was watching with hopeful eyes. The young man felt something shift inside him, something small but strong. "I can try," he said. The director didn't look impressed, but he didn't have many options left. He sighed. "Fine, we just need someone to run through the pieces." "Nothing complicated?" The young man nodded. His hands felt cold as he walked toward the piano. Everyone stepped aside, some curious, some doubtful. No one expected anything from him. That was what made the room feel heavier than ever. Expectations can create pressure. But having no expectations at all, sometimes that hurts more. He sat down on the bench. His fingers hovered above the keys. For a moment, memories of all the nights he had played alone came rushing back. The empty room. The dim light. The quiet air. The one place where he didn't feel judged. But this wasn't that room. This time, dozens of eyes were watching him, and one of them belonged to the director whose opinion could change many lives. He took a slow breath. Trying to calm his racing thoughts, the director stood with his arms crossed. Waiting for a simple tune, nothing more. The young man looked at the keys again. They felt familiar, like an old friend he hadn't seen in a long time. He placed his fingers gently on them. And for the first time in his life, he was about to play in front of people who never believed he could. The room felt strangely quiet as he sat in front of the piano. It wasn't the kind of quiet that comforted him. It was the heavy kind that came with waiting eyes and silent judgment. He kept his head slightly lowered, hoping no one noticed how his hands trembled. He tried to steady his breathing, but even that felt difficult. He had practiced many times before, alone in an empty room where the only sound was the soft echo of his own playing. But now, with the director standing only a few steps away and several students watching with folded arms and doubtful eyes, he felt as if every breath, every small move, every tiny sound he made carried weight. The director signaled his assistant to hand him the sheet music. The young man took it with careful fingers, trying not to show the nervousness he felt. The paper looked too clean, too formal, too important. He placed it on the stand and tried to read it. Though the notes blurred for a moment because of the pressure building in his chest, the director spoke calmly. "Just play the opening part. That's all we need." His voice wasn't harsh, but it held a tone that said he didn't expect much. The young man nodded, took another breath, and placed his hands gently on the keys. Before playing, he closed his eyes for one quiet second. He imagined the empty practice room he knew so well, the dim lights, the stillness, the comfort of solitude. He imagined no one watching, no one whispering, no one judging. When he opened his eyes again, he felt slightly more steady. He pressed the first key. It was soft, almost too soft, like he was testing the water before stepping in. The note floated into the air, fragile but clear. The director raised his eyebrows slightly, not out of surprise, but because he wasn't expecting someone so quiet to play with such careful control. He played another note, and then another. Slowly the melody began to form. His hands started to remember the movement his mind had forgotten only moments ago. The sound grew steadier as he continued, and though the room stayed silent, something inside him felt a little less afraid. A few of the students exchanged looks. They still weren't impressed, but they weren't laughing either. Only the older staff member who had recommended him watched with a calm smile, as if he knew this moment meant more to the young man than anyone else could understand. Halfway through the piece, he made a small mistake, a single note that came a bit too early. He froze for a second. His heart jumped. He heard a soft whisper behind him, maybe someone making a small comment. That was enough to make his confidence shake again. The director glanced at him, not with irritation but with a neutral expression, as if waiting to see whether he would fall apart or continue. He swallowed, pressed another key, and continued. The melody flowed again, returning to its calm path. His hands moved more naturally as the seconds passed. He didn't do anything impressive, nothing bold or breathtaking, but he played with sincerity, as if he were telling a story only he understood. When he finished, the last note lingered softly in the air. He kept his fingers on the keys for a moment before lifting them slowly. Then he looked at the director, unsure what to expect. The director didn't clap. Neither did the students. They didn't make any sound at all. Instead, the director simply nodded. "That will work for rehearsals," he said. "Thank you." That was it. The young man lowered his gaze. He didn't know how to feel. A small part of him wished the director had shown more emotion, surprise, interest, anything. But another part of him felt relief that he hadn't embarrassed himself. He stood up from the bench. Stepping aside so the rehearsal could continue, one of the students whispered to another, "At least he didn't mess up too badly." The comment stung slightly, but he kept walking. He told himself it didn't matter. At least he had tried. At least he hadn't frozen completely. As the rehearsal moved on, he stayed close to the corner of the room, adjusting cables and handing out papers, slipping back into the background like he always did. But something inside him had changed, even if the change was small. For the first time, he had played in front of real people, not imaginary listeners in an empty room. And he hadn't fallen apart. Later that evening, after everyone had left, he stayed in the rehearsal room longer than usual. The building was almost empty except for the distant sound of someone closing doors. The piano sat quietly in the center of the room, waiting. He walked toward it slowly, sat down, and let his fingers rest on the keys. No one was watching now. No judging eyes. No whispered comments. Just him and the familiar quiet. He began playing the same piece again, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to reassure himself that he could do it. The notes flowed more gently this time, like water finding its natural path. He closed his eyes and let the sound fill the room. The silence around him felt warm rather than heavy. He didn't know the director had returned to the doorway. The director had come back to pick up a forgotten notebook. But when he heard the piano, he stopped. Standing just outside the room, he watched for a few moments, unnoticed. And what he saw surprised him. The young man wasn't just playing. He was pouring feeling into the keys, the kind of feeling that doesn't show up under pressure but emerges only when someone feels safe. His hands moved with confidence he hadn't shown earlier. His expression softened, focused, peaceful. The director stayed silent. He didn't interrupt. He just watched with thoughtful eyes. Then, after a minute, he quietly walked away before the young man noticed him. The next day, the young man arrived early as always. But this time he felt a slightly different energy inside him. Like a quiet spark had been lit the night before, during the morning rehearsal. The director asked him to sit at the piano again. "Play the opening once more," the director said. He blinked, surprised. He wasn't expecting that. Some students looked confused too. He sat down and prepared himself. His hands were still, waiting for a signal. "Start," the director said. He played. And though he still felt nervous, his playing had a bit more strength today. Not much, but enough for the director to notice the difference. After he finished, the director nodded slowly, as if thinking, "Stay near the piano today," he said. "I may need you again." Those words made his heart flutter with a mix of shock and disbelief. He nodded quickly. As the day went on, he found himself being asked to play small sections of different pieces. He wasn't amazing at all of them, but he played with dedication. And every time he played, the director listened carefully. Not with excitement, but with curiosity. Some students still whispered behind his back, wondering why the director kept asking him to play. They didn't understand what the director had seen the night before, how the young man played when no one was watching. In the afternoon, the director asked him to stay back for a few minutes. The room was nearly empty. "Do you play often?" the director asked. He hesitated, unsure how much to share. "Only when the building is empty." "Why only then?" the director asked. He looked down, tapping a key softly. "Because it feels easier. No one expects anything." The director didn't say anything for a moment. He just watched him with thoughtful eyes. "Sometimes," the director finally said, "the ones who hide their talent are the ones who feel it the deepest." The young man didn't reply. He didn't know what to say. The director placed a sheet on the piano. "This is a solo piece for the showcase," he said. "I want you to try it." "Not now. Practice it alone if you need to." "I just want to see what you can do." The young man stared at the paper. His heart began to beat faster again. A solo piece? For the showcase? It felt unreal, impossible. He looked up at the director, unsure if he had heard correctly. But the director simply nodded and walked out of the room. The young man picked up the sheet, his hands shaking more from disbelief than fear. For the first time in his life, someone wasn't whispering behind his back. Someone was giving him a chance. And deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning. He held the sheet of music in his hands for a long time after the director left. His fingers kept tracing the edges of the paper, almost as if he needed to touch it again and again to believe it was real. A solo piece. A piece meant for the showcase. Something that was supposed to be played by someone the director trusted. Someone trained. Someone confident, not someone like him. The thought made his heart beat faster every time it crossed his mind. He tucked the sheet carefully into his bag, making sure it wouldn't bend. The whole walk home, his mind kept replaying the director's words. "I want you to try it." Simple words, but they felt heavier than anything he had carried before. He couldn't decide whether he felt happy, scared, or confused. Maybe he felt all three at the same time. That night he sat alone in his small room with the sheet spread out on his desk. He studied the notes slowly, trying to understand the rhythm and emotion the composer wanted. The piece wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the most complicated pieces he had ever seen. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it required control, feeling, and a kind of confidence he wasn't sure he had yet. He closed his eyes and imagined the sound of it. He could almost hear how it should be played. Soft in some places, bold in others. A story told through keys. He practiced late into the night, as quietly as he could, trying not to disturb the people living next door. Every mistake reminded him how unprepared he was. Every smooth section reminded him why he loved music in the first place. Hours passed before he finally forced himself to stop. The next morning, his eyes felt heavy from lack of sleep, but something inside him felt alive. He reached the music center earlier than usual. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the hallways were still dim. He sat at the main piano, opened the sheet, and took a deep breath. The first note he played echoed softly through the empty room. Then another, and another. Slowly, piece by piece, he tried to understand the music with his fingers, not just his eyes. Sometimes the notes felt right, sometimes not. But he didn't stop trying. The sound of the door opening made him jump. He turned around and saw the older staff member walking in with a gentle smile. "You're here early." The older man said, "I just wanted to practice," he replied. Trying not to sound nervous, the older man listened for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "It suits you," he said quietly and walked away. Leaving him alone with the piano again. Throughout the day, whenever he found an empty moment, he practiced the solo. When students weren't around, he played a section softly. When the director wasn't watching, he tried a harder part. His hands slowly began to understand the piece, though they still stumbled more times than he liked. Some students noticed he was spending more time at the piano. A few of them whispered again, "Why is he practicing so much? The director is probably just being polite. He'll never be good enough for a solo." Their words floated through the air like dust. He tried to brush them off, but some of them landed on his heart anyway. One afternoon, while he was practicing, the director entered the room quietly. The young man didn't notice until he finished a section and turned his head. He immediately stood up, feeling embarrassed. "Sit," the director said. "Play it again." The young man hesitated but slowly sat down again. His hands felt stiff as he placed them on the keys. The director remained standing, arms crossed. Watching carefully, he began playing, knowing every note he produced mattered now. At first, the melody felt shaky, his fingers too tense. But then he took a small breath, just like he did when he practiced alone, and suddenly the notes sounded softer, more natural. His hands settled into the rhythm he had repeated so many times the night before. The director didn't blink. He followed every movement, every pause, every mistake. When the young man finished, silence filled the room. He looked down at his hands, unable to read the director's expression. "You have a good touch," the director finally said. "But you're holding back." The young man lifted his eyes, unsure what to say. "Music isn't about being cautious," the director continued. "It's about letting people feel something. Right now you're playing correctly, but not bravely." The words hit him harder than he expected. He wasn't offended. He knew the director was right. He had spent his whole life playing quietly, hiding his talent, avoiding attention, avoiding judgment. Fear had become part of his playing without him realizing it. I'm trying," he said softly. "I know," the director replied. "That's why I want you to keep practicing this piece. Not to show perfection, but to show yourself." The director left the room, leaving him with more thoughts than answers. For the next few days, the young man practiced even harder. He stayed long after everyone went home. He repeated the difficult sections until his fingers ached. He worked on softening the quieter parts, strengthening the bold ones, and connecting the emotions hidden between the notes. Sometimes frustration made him stop. Sometimes doubt made him question why the director had given him this chance. But every time he felt like giving up, he reminded himself of the moment the director had paused outside the room listening to him play. The director had seen something in him, something worth encouraging. One evening as he practiced alone, he closed his eyes and played without looking at the sheet. He let the music guide him rather than force himself to guide the music. For the first time, the piece felt like it belonged to him. Each note felt like a word he had been waiting to say. Each movement felt like a memory he wanted to share. He didn't notice that the director had once again stopped in the doorway, watching quietly. This time the director smiled faintly, something he rarely did. The next morning, the director gathered everyone for rehearsal. The young man stood among the group, not expecting anything unusual. But then the director spoke his name. "I want him to rehearse the solo today." The room fell silent. Some students looked confused. Some looked irritated. Others looked curious to see what would happen. He felt his heart drop to his stomach. He wasn't ready. Or maybe he was? He couldn't tell anymore. "Take your place," the director said. He walked slowly toward the piano, feeling every step as if the floor might disappear beneath him. When he sat down, he could feel the weight of everyone's eyes. His hands shook slightly, but he tried to hide it. The director gave a small nod. He began to play. The first few notes felt careful, but then he remembered the director's words, "Stop holding back." So he took a deeper breath and allowed himself to feel the music. His hands moved with purpose. The soft parts glowed gently, the bold parts rose with strength. The room stayed completely silent as he played, not out of boredom, but out of surprise. People who once doubted him now watched with widened eyes. The same students who had whispered behind his back now leaned forward, listening to each note. The older staff member smiled proudly from the corner when he reached the final note. It floated into the air and dissolved slowly, leaving a stillness no one wanted to break. He lowered his hands and looked up nervously. The director didn't move for several seconds. Then he stepped forward and said quietly, "That is what I wanted to hear." The young man's chest tightened, not from fear, but from sudden relief. The director turned to the rest of the room. "This solo will be part of the showcase, and he will be the one performing it." The room erupted into whispers, some surprised, some amazed, some unsure how to react. But for the first time in his life, the whispers weren't about his weakness. They were about his talent. He sat silently at the piano, trying to absorb what had just happened. He had never imagined he would reach this moment. He didn't know whether to smile, cry, or simply sit still. All he knew was that something inside him had changed forever, and the next part of his journey was waiting. The days leading up to the showcase felt unreal to him. Every morning, he woke up with a strange mix of excitement and fear twisting inside his chest. He had never been part of anything this big before. He had never stood on a stage in front of an audience. He had never been trusted with a moment that meant so much to so many people. And now, suddenly, he was not just part of the show, he was performing a solo that carried his heart inside every note. At the music center, rehearsals continued with a new kind of pressure. Everyone was practicing harder, moving faster, speaking more seriously. The director wanted the showcase to be perfect, and he pushed everyone to give their best. But strangely, the director was softer with the young man. Not easy, not gentle, just fair, honest, as if he understood how important this moment was for him. Every time the young man played during rehearsals, the director listened closely, correcting small things, helping him understand deeper parts of the music. Some students still looked at him with disbelief, others with respect, and a few with jealousy. But the whispers had changed. Now they weren't about him being unimportant. They were whispers of curiosity, of surprise, of people trying to understand how someone so quiet had suddenly become the center of attention. Still, the young man tried not to let it distract him. He focused on the music, the movements of his fingers, the rise and fall of the melody. Every evening, long after everyone left, he stayed behind to practice alone. The building would be quiet, the lights dim, and the piano waiting for him like an old friend. Sometimes he played well, sometimes he stumbled, but he kept going. Not because he wanted to impress anyone. He practiced because this was his chance, maybe the only one he would ever get, to show the world the part of himself he had kept hidden all these years. The night before the showcase, he sat in the empty rehearsal room again. The moonlight slipped through the tall windows, touching the polished surface of the piano. He placed his hands on the keys, feeling their coolness. He didn't play right away. He just sat there, breathing slowly, thinking about everything that had brought him to this point, the quiet mornings arranging chairs, the whispers behind his back, the lonely nights practicing alone. The moment the director heard him by accident, the first time he played the solo for the group, the moment he saw surprise in their eyes instead of doubt, he took a deep breath and played the piece one more time. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but honestly. When he finished, he closed the piano gently and whispered to himself, "This is enough." The next day arrived faster than he expected. The showcase was being held in a large auditorium filled with bright lights, thick curtains, and rows of seats that seemed endless. Performers rushed backstage, adjusting their clothes, checking their instruments, whispering last-minute reminders to themselves. The air buzzed with nerves. He stood in a quiet corner, holding his sheet music, even though he had memorized every note. His heart thumped hard and his palms felt cold. He wasn't used to this world of noise and movement. He wasn't used to being surrounded by people who were confident, loud, ready to show their talent. He felt small again, like the quiet helper he had always been. The director approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You'll be fine," the director said softly. "Remember what I told you. Play with honesty, not fear." He nodded, though his throat felt tight. The director stayed with him for a moment longer before walking away to prepare the rest of the show. As he waited for his turn, he listened to the performers before him. The singers sounded strong, the violinists crisp and full of life, the dancers powerful and graceful. Every performance made his heart beat faster, reminding him that he would soon step onto that stage with nothing but a piano to protect him. When the assistant finally called his name, his legs felt strangely weak. He walked toward the stage slowly, forcing himself to breathe deeply. The curtains were thick and heavy, hiding the audience from view, but he could hear them, the soft coughs, the whispers, the shifting of seats. He knew they were out there, waiting, expecting. The director stood near the side of the stage, giving him one final nod. Not a nod of pressure, just encouragement. The lights dimmed slightly. A hush fell over the audience. He stepped onto the stage. The lights above warmed his skin. The hall looked enormous from where he stood. He walked toward the piano, each step echoing softly. When he reached it, he pulled the bench out slowly and sat down. His hands shook even before he touched the keys. He closed his eyes briefly and remembered the quiet practice room, the empty building at night, the peaceful feeling of playing without fear. He imagined he was there again. Just him and the piano. When he opened his eyes, he placed his fingers gently on the keys and he began to play. The first notes whispered into the air, soft but clear. The audience leaned in, listening closely. His fingers moved slowly at first, guided by memory and hope. But as the melody grew, something inside him loosened. His nerves faded. His heartbeat steadied. It was as if the music was taking him by the hand, leading him through a story he knew. By heart, he forgot about the audience, he forgot about the whispers, he forgot about the judgment from the past. He played as if he were alone, pouring every hidden part of himself into the keys. His hands moved without hesitation, shaping each note with care. The soft parts trembled with emotion. The powerful parts rose like a wave. Every moment felt alive. People in the audience began to sit straighter, drawn in by his unexpected passion. Some exchanged surprised glances. A few held their breath. Backstage, some students watched through the curtain, their eyes wide. The older staff members stood in the wings with a proud smile. Even the director, who had seen countless musicians in his life, stared at the young man with quiet admiration. As the piece neared its final section, something magical happened inside him. It felt like all the years of silence, all the quiet suffering, all the hidden dreams were finally being released. His heart pressed into every note, every movement, every small rise and fall of the melody. He played not to impress the director, not to prove the students wrong, but simply because the music inside him had waited too long to be heard. When the final note floated into the air, it lingered for a long moment before fading. He kept his hands on the keys, afraid to move. The hall was silent, completely silent. He didn't know if that was good or bad. Then the applause began, soft at first, then louder, then overwhelming. People stood up, clapping harder, cheering. The sound washed over him so strongly he almost couldn't breathe. He lifted his head slowly, stunned. The lights blurred a little as his eyes misted, but he blinked quickly to clear them. He stood from the bench with shaky legs. The director walked onto the stage, placed a hand on his shoulder, and whispered, "You did it." Those 3 words felt like the greatest reward he had ever received. When he walked backstage, some performers clapped him on the back. Others smiled warmly. A few who once doubted him now looked at him with genuine admiration. And the older staff member wrapped an arm around him proudly, saying, "I knew you had this in you." In that moment, he realized something deeply important. The stage wasn't what made him feel alive. The applause wasn't what gave him meaning. It was the music, the part of himself he had hidden for so long, that had finally found its way into the world. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just the quiet helper who arranged chairs or fixed piano benches. He was someone who had something to say, and he had finally said it. That night, as he walked home with the cool air touching his face and the sounds of applause still echoing softly in his mind, he felt lighter than he had ever felt. It didn't matter what people whispered before. It didn't matter who doubted him. What mattered was that when the moment came to show who he truly was, he didn't hide. He played, and the world listened.